Tantor Audio presents The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, by Christopher Clark, narrated by Derek Perkins. Introduction. The European continent was at peace on the morning of Sunday the 28th of June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie Chotek arrived at Sarajevo railway station. 37 days later, it was at war. The conflict that began that summer mobilized 65 million troops, claimed 3 empires, 20 million military and civilian deaths, and 21 million wounded. The horrors of Europe's 20th century were born of this catastrophe. It was, as the American historian Fritz Stern put it, the first calamity of the 20th century, the calamity from which all other calamities sprang. The debate over why it happened began before the first shots were fired, and has been running ever since. It has spawned an historical literature of unparalleled size, sophistication, and moral intensity. For international relations theorists, the events of 1914 remain the political crisis par excellence, intricate enough to accommodate any number of hypotheses. The historian who seeks to understand the genesis of the First World War confronts several problems. The first and most obvious is an oversupply of sources. Each of the belligerent states produced official multi-volume editions of diplomatic papers, vast works of collective archival labor. There are treacherous currents in this ocean of sources. Most of the official document editions produced in the interwar period have an apologetic spin. The 57-volume German publication, Die Große Politik, comprising 15,889 documents organized in 300 subject areas, was not prepared with purely scholarly objectives in mind. It was hoped that the disclosure of the pre-war record would suffice to refute the war guilt thesis enshrined in the terms of the Versailles Treaty. For the French government, too, the post-war publication of documents was an enterprise of essentially political character, as Foreign Minister Jean-Louis Barthou put it in May 1934. Its purpose was to counterbalance the campaign launched by Germany following the Treaty of Versailles. In Vienna, as Ludwig Bittner, co-editor of the 8-volume collection Österreich-Ungarns Außenpolitik, pointed out in 1926, the aim was to produce an authoritative source edition before some international body, the League of Nations perhaps, forced the Austrian government into publication under less auspicious circumstances. The early Soviet documentary publications were motivated in part by the desire to prove that the war had been initiated by the autocratic Tsar and his alliance partner, the bourgeois Raymond Poincaré, in the hope of delegitimizing French demands for the repayment of pre-war loans. Even in Britain, where British Documents on the Origins of the War was launched amid high-minded appeals to disinterested scholarship, the resulting documentary record was not without tendentious omissions that produced a somewhat unbalanced picture of Britain's place in the events preceding the outbreak of war in 1914. In short, the great European documentary editions were, for all their undeniable value to scholars, munitions in a world war of documents, as the German military historian Bernhard Schwertweger remarked in a critical study of 1929. The memoirs of statesmen, commanders, and other key decision-makers, though indispensable to anyone trying to understand what happened on the road to war, are no less problematic. Some are frustratingly reticent on questions of burning interest. To name just a few examples, the Reflections on the World War, published in 1919 by German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, has virtually nothing to say on the subject of his actions or those of his colleagues during the July crisis of 1914. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov's political memoirs are breezy, pompous, intermittently mendacious, and totally uninformative about his own role in key events. French President Raymond Poincaré's 10-volume memoir of his years in power is propagandistic rather than revelatory. There are striking discrepancies between his recollections of events during the crisis and the contemporary jottings in his unpublished diary. The amiable memoirs of British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey are sketchy on the delicate question of the commitments he had made to the Entente powers before August 1914, and the role these played in his handling of the crisis. When the American historian Bernadette Everly Schmidt of the University of Chicago travelled to Europe in the late 1920s with letters of introduction to interview former politicians who had played a role in events, he was struck by the apparently total immunity of his interlocutors to self-doubt. The one exception was Grey, who spontaneously remarked that he had made a tactical error in seeking to negotiate with Vienna through Berlin during the July crisis, but the misjudgment alluded to was of subordinate importance, and the comment reflected a specifically English style of Mandarin self-deprecation rather than a genuine concession of responsibility. There were problems with memory, too. Schmidt tracked down Peter Bach, the former Russian Minister of Finance, now a London banker. In 1914, Bach had participated in meetings at which decisions of momentous importance were made. Yet, when Schmidt met him, Bach insisted that he had little recollection of events from that era. Fortunately, the former minister's own contemporary notes are more informative. When the researcher Luciano Magrini travelled to Belgrade in the autumn of 1937 to interview every surviving figure with a known link to the Sarajevo conspiracy, he found that there were some witnesses who attested to matters of which they could have no knowledge, others who remained dumb or gave a false account of what they know, and others again who added adornments to their statements or were mainly interested in self-justification. There are, moreover, still significant gaps in our knowledge. Many important exchanges between key actors were verbal and are not recorded. They can be reconstructed only from indirect evidence or later testimony. The Serbian organizations linked with the assassination at Sarajevo were extremely secretive and left virtually no paper trail. Dragutin Dimitrijević, head of Serbian military intelligence, a key figure in the plot to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo, regularly burned his papers. Much remains unknown about the precise content of the earliest discussions between Vienna and Berlin on what should be done in response to the assassinations at Sarajevo. The minutes of the summit meetings that took place between the French and Russian political leaderships in St. Petersburg on the 20th to the 23rd of June, documents of potentially enormous importance to understanding the last phase of the crisis, have never been found. The Russian protocols were probably simply lost. The French team entrusted with editing the Documents diplomatiques français failed to find the French version. The Bolsheviks did publish many key diplomatic documents in an effort to discredit the imperialist machinations of the great powers, but these appeared at irregular intervals in no particular order and were generally focused on specific issues, such as Russian designs on the Bosphorus. Some documents, the exact number is still unknown, were lost in transit during the chaos of the Civil War, and the Soviet Union never produced a systematically compiled documentary record to rival the British, French, German, and Austrian source editions. The published record on the Russian side remains, to this day, far from complete. The exceptionally intricate structure of this crisis is another distinctive feature. The Cuban Missile Crisis was complex enough, yet it involved just two principal protagonists, the USA and the Soviet Union, plus a range of proxies and subordinate players. By contrast, the story of how this war came about must make sense of the multilateral interactions among 5 autonomous players of equal importance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, and Britain. 6, if we add Italy, plus various other strategically significant and equally autonomous sovereign actors, such as the Ottoman Empire and the states of the Balkan Peninsula, a region of high political tension and instability in the years before the outbreak of war. A further element of convolution arises from the fact that policy-making processes within the states caught up in the crisis were often far from transparent. One can think of July 1914 as an international crisis, a term that suggests an array of nation-states, conceived as compact, autonomous, discrete entities like billiard balls on a table. But the sovereign structures that generated policy during the crisis were profoundly disunified. There was uncertainty, and has been ever since among historians, about where exactly the power to shape policy was located within the various executives, and policies, or at least policy-driving initiatives of various kinds, did not necessarily come from the apex of the system. They could emanate from quite peripheral locations in the diplomatic apparatus, from military commanders, from ministerial officials, and even from ambassadors, who were often policymakers in their own right. The surviving sources thus offer up a chaos of promises, threats, plans, and prognostications, and this in turn helps to explain why the outbreak of this war has proved susceptible to such a bewildering variety of interpretations. There is virtually no viewpoint on its origins that cannot be supported from a selection of the available sources. And this helps, in turn, to explain why the World War I origins literature has assumed such vast dimensions that no single historian, not even a fantasy figure with an easy command of all the necessary languages, could hope to read it in one lifetime. 20 years ago, an overview of the current literature counted 25,000 books and articles. Some accounts have focused on the culpability of one bad apple state. Germany has been most popular, but not one of the great powers has escaped the ascription of chief responsibility. Others have shared the blame around, or have looked for faults in the system. There was always enough complexity to keep the argument going. And beyond the debates of the historians, which have tended to turn on questions of culpability or the relationship between individual agency and structural constraint, there is a substantial international relations commentary in which categories such as deterrence, détente, and inadvertence, or universalizable mechanisms such as balancing, bargaining, and bandwagoning, occupy center stage. Though the debate on this subject is now nearly a century old, there is no reason to believe that it has run its course. But if the debate is old, the subject is still fresh. In fact, it is fresher and more relevant now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. The changes in our own world have altered our perspective on the events of 1914. In the 1960s to 80s, a kind of period charm accumulated in popular awareness around the events of 1914. It was easy to imagine the disaster of Europe's last summer as an Edwardian costume drama. The effete rituals and gaudy uniforms, the ornamentalism of a world still largely organized around hereditary monarchy, had a distancing effect on present-day recollection. They seemed to signal that the protagonists were people from another vanished world. The presumption stealthily asserted itself that if the actors' hats had gaudy green ostrich feathers on them, then their thoughts and motivations probably did too. And yet what must strike any 21st century reader who follows the course of the summer crisis of 1914 is its raw modernity. It began with a squad of suicide bombers and a cavalcade of automobiles. Behind the outrage at Sarajevo was an avowedly terrorist organization with a cult of sacrifice, death, and revenge. But this organization was extraterritorial, without a clear geographical or political location. It was scattered in cells across political borders. It was unaccountable. Its links to any sovereign government were oblique, hidden, and certainly very difficult to discern from outside the organization. Indeed, one could even say that July 1914 is less remote from us, less illegible, now than it was in the 1980s. Since the end of the Cold War, a system of global bipolar stability has made way for a more complex and unpredictable array of forces, including declining empires and rising powers, a state of affairs that invites comparison with the Europe of 1914. These shifts in perspective prompt us to rethink the story of how war came to Europe. Accepting this challenge does not mean embracing a vulgar presentism that remakes the past to meet the needs of the present, but rather acknowledging those features of the past of which our changed vantage point can afford us a clearer view. Among these is the Balkan context of the war's inception. Serbia is one of the blind spots in the historiography of the July crisis. The assassination at Sarajevo is treated in many accounts as a mere pretext, an event with little bearing on the real forces whose interaction brought about the conflict. In an excellent recent account of the outbreak of war in 1914, the authors declare that the killings at Sarajevo by themselves caused nothing. It was the use made of this event that brought the nations to war. The marginalization of the Serbian, and thereby of the larger Balkan dimension of the story, began during the July crisis itself, which opened as a response to the murders at Sarajevo, but later changed gear, entering a geopolitical phase in which Serbia and its actions occupied a subordinate place. Our moral compass has shifted too. The fact that Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia emerged as one of the victor states of the war seemed implicitly to vindicate the act of the man who pulled the trigger on the 28th of June. Certainly that was the view of the Yugoslav authorities, who marked the spot where he did so with bronze footprints and a plaque celebrating the assassin's first steps into Yugoslav freedom. In an era when the national idea was still full of promise, there was an intuitive sympathy with South Slav nationalism and little affection for the ponderous multinational commonwealth of the Habsburg Empire. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s have reminded us of the lethality of Balkan nationalism. Since Srebrenica and the siege of Sarajevo, it has become harder to think of Serbia as the mere object or victim of great power politics, and easier to conceive of Serbian nationalism as an historical force in its own right. From the perspective of today's European Union, we are inclined to look more sympathetically, or at least less contemptuously, than we used to on the vanished imperial patchwork of Habsburg, Austria-Hungary. Lastly, it is perhaps less obvious now that we should dismiss the two killings at Sarajevo as a mere mishap incapable of carrying real causal weight. The attack on the World Trade Center in September 2001 exemplified the way in which a single symbolic event, however deeply it may be enmeshed in larger historical processes, can change politics irrevocably, rendering old options obsolete and endowing new ones with an unforeseen urgency. Putting Sarajevo and the Balkans back at the center of the story does not mean demonizing the Serbs or their statesmen, nor does it dispense us from the obligation to understand the forces working on and in those Serbian politicians, officers and activists whose behavior and decisions helped to determine what kind of consequences the shootings at Sarajevo would have. This audiobook thus strives to understand the July crisis of 1914 as a modern event, the most complex of modern times, perhaps of any time so far. It is concerned less with why the war happened than with how it came about. Questions of why and how are logically inseparable, but they lead us in different directions. The question of how invites us to look closely at the sequences of interactions that produced certain outcomes. By contrast, the question of why invites us to go in search of remote and categorical causes: imperialism, nationalism, armaments, alliances, high finance, ideas of national honor, the mechanics of mobilization. The why approach brings a certain analytical clarity, but it also has a distorting effect, because it creates the illusion of steadily building causal pressure. The factors pile up on top of each other, pushing down on the events. Political actors become mere executors of forces long established and beyond their control. The story this audiobook tells is, by contrast, saturated with agency. The key decision-makers, kings, emperors, foreign ministers, ambassadors, military commanders, and a host of lesser officials, walked towards danger in watchful, calculated steps. The outbreak of war was the culmination of chains of decisions made by political actors with conscious objectives, who were capable of a degree of self-reflection, acknowledged in a range of options, and formed the best judgment they could on the basis of the best information they had to hand. Nationalism, armaments, alliances, and finance were all part of the story, but they can be made to carry real explanatory weight only if they can be seen to have shaped the decisions that, in combination, made war break out. A Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars recently observed that once we pose the question why, guilt becomes the focal point. Questions of guilt and responsibility in the outbreak of war entered this story even before the war had begun. The entire source record is full of ascriptions of blame. This was a world in which aggressive intentions were always assigned to the opponent and defensive intentions to oneself. And the judgment delivered by Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles has ensured the continuing prominence of the war guilt question. Here, too, the focus on how suggests an alternative approach. A journey through the events that is not driven by the need to draw up a charge sheet against this or that state or individual, but aims to identify the decisions that brought war about and to understand the reasoning or emotions behind them. This does not mean excluding questions of responsibility entirely from the discussion. The aim is rather to let the why answers grow, as it were, out of the how answers, rather than the other way around. This audiobook tells the story of how war came to continental Europe. It traces the paths to war in a multi-layered narrative encompassing the key decision centres in Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, London and Belgrade, with brief excursions to Rome, Constantinople and Sofia. It is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 focuses on the 2 antagonists, Serbia and Austria-Hungary, whose quarrel ignited the conflict, following their interaction down to the eve of the Sarajevo assassinations. Part 2 breaks with the narrative approach to ask 4 questions in 4 chapters. How did the polarization of Europe into opposed blocs come about? How did the governments of the European states generate foreign policy? How did the Balkans, a peripheral region far from Europe's centres of power and wealth, come to be the theatre of a crisis of such magnitude? How did an international system that seemed to be entering an era of détente produce a general war? Part 3 opens with the assassinations at Sarajevo and offers a narrative of the July crisis itself, examining the interactions between the key decision centres and bringing to light the calculations, misunderstandings and decisions that drove the crisis from one phase to the next. It is a central argument of this audiobook that the events of July 1914 make sense only when we illuminate the journeys travelled by the key decision-makers. To do this, we need to do more than simply revisit the sequence of international crises that preceded the outbreak of war. We need to understand how those events were experienced and woven into narratives that structured perceptions and motivated behaviour. Why did the men whose decisions took Europe to war behave and see things as they did? How did the sense of fearfulness and foreboding that one finds in so many of the sources connect with the arrogance and swaggering we encounter, often in the very same individuals? Why did such exotic figures of the pre-war scene as the Albanian question and the Bulgarian loan matter so much, and how were they joined up in the heads of those who had political power? When decision-makers discoursed on the international situation or on external threats, were they seeing something real, or projecting their own fears and desires onto their opponents, or both? The aim has been to reconstruct as vividly as possible the highly dynamic decision positions occupied by the key actors before and during the summer of 1914. Some of the most interesting recent writing on the subject has argued that, far from being inevitable, this war was in fact improbable, at least until it actually happened. From this, it would follow that the conflict was not the consequence of a long-run deterioration, but of short-term shocks to the international system. Whether one accepts this view or not, it has the merit of opening the story to an element of contingency. And it is certainly true that while some of the developments I examine in this audiobook seem to point unequivocally in the direction of what actually transpired in 1914, there are other vectors of pre-war change that suggest different, unrealized outcomes. With this in mind, the audiobook aims to show how the pieces of causality were assembled that, once in place, enabled the war to happen, but to do so without over-determining the outcome. I have tried to remain alert to the fact that the people, events, and forces described in this book carried in them the seeds of other, perhaps less terrible, futures. Part 1. Roads to Sarajevo. 1. Serbian Ghosts. Murder in Belgrade. Shortly after 2 o'clock on the morning of the 11th of June, 1903, 28 officers of the Serbian army approached the main entrance of the royal palace in Belgrade. After an exchange of fire, the sentries standing guard before the building were arrested and disarmed. With keys taken from the duty captain, the conspirators broke into the reception hall and made for the royal bedchamber, hurrying up stairways and along corridors. Finding the king's apartments barred by a pair of heavy oaken doors, the conspirators blew them open with a carton of dynamite. The charge was so strong that the doors were torn from their hinges and thrown across the antechamber inside, killing the royal adjutant behind them. The blast also fused the palace electrics, so that the building was plunged into darkness. Unperturbed, the intruders discovered some candles in a nearby room and entered the royal apartment. By the time they reached the bedroom, King Alexander and Queen Draga were no longer to be found. But the Queen's French novel was splayed face down on the bedside table. Someone touched the sheets and felt that the bed was still warm. It seemed they had only recently left. Having searched the bedchamber in vain, the intruders combed through the palace with candles and drawn revolvers. While the officers strode from room to room, firing at cabinets, tapestries, sofas, and other potential hiding places, King Alexander and Queen Draga huddled upstairs in a tiny annex adjoining the bedchamber where the Queen's maids usually ironed and darned her clothes. For nearly 2 hours the search continued. The king took advantage of this interlude to dress as quietly as he could in a pair of trousers and a red silk shirt. He had no wish to be found naked by his enemies. The Queen managed to cover herself in a petticoat, white silk stays, and a single yellow stocking. Across Belgrade, other victims were found and killed. The Queen's 2 brothers, widely suspected of harbouring designs on the Serbian throne, were induced to leave their sister's home in Belgrade and taken to a guardhouse close to the palace, where they were insulted and barbarously stabbed. Assassins also broke into the apartments of the Prime Minister, Dimitrije Cincar Marković, and the Minister of War, Milovan Pavlović. Both were slain. 25 rounds were fired into Pavlović, who had concealed himself in a wooden chest. Interior Minister Belimir Teodorovich was shot and mistakenly left for dead, but later recovered from his wounds. Other ministers were placed under arrest. Back at the palace, the king's loyal first adjutant, Lazar Petrovich, who had been disarmed and seized after an exchange of fire, was led through the darkened halls by the assassins and forced to call out to the king from every door. Returning to the royal chamber for a second search, the conspirators at last found a concealed entry behind the drapery. When one of the assailants proposed to cut the wall open with an axe, Petrovich saw that the game was up and agreed to ask the king to come out. From behind the panelling, the king inquired who was calling, to which his adjutant responded, "I am your Lazar. Open the door to your officers." The king replied, "Can I trust the oath of my officers?" The conspirators replied in the affirmative. According to one account, the king, flabby, bespectacled, and incongruously dressed in his red silk shirt, emerged with his arms around the queen. The couple were cut down in a hail of shots at point-blank range.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?